and that the spiritual work of modern Norse paganism must therefore include the work of ecological restoration and the cultivation of genuine relationships with the living animals that embody the sacred traditions of the old faith. This debate within the Asatru community reflects a broader tension in modern spiritual culture between the textual and the experiential, between the recovery of spiritual traditions through study and the recovery of spiritual traditions through direct engagement with the natural and the non-human world, a tension that is not unique to Norse paganism, but that is particularly acute in a tradition whose sacred animal relationships were so deeply embedded in direct ecological experience. The resolution of this tension, if it can be resolved, may require a synthesis of both approaches, a combination of serious engagement with the textual and archaeological evidence for the Norse sacred animal tradition and direct, embodied engagement with the living wolves and ravens that are still present in the world, still available to teach, still offering to those who are willing to pay attention the same lessons about the nature of reality and the possibilities of consciousness that they offered to the Norse people who first learned to see them as sacred. The conservation movement's growing recognition of the spiritual and cultural dimensions of human relationships with wolves and ravens provides an unexpected point of convergence between the ancient Norse sacred animal tradition and the contemporary ecological crisis, a convergence that suggests that the Norse understanding of these animals as sacred presences deserving of respect and serious engagement may be not merely of historical interest, but of genuine practical relevance to the challenges that face the modern world. The work of conservation biologists and wildlife managers who advocate for wolf and raven protection often draws, explicitly or implicitly, on a recognition that these animals have a significance that exceeds their purely ecological function, that they are keystone species in a cultural as well as a biological sense, creatures whose presence or absence from a landscape affects not just the ecological dynamics of that landscape, but the spiritual and psychological relationship that the human communities who share that landscape maintain with the non-human world. This recognition, while it is expressed in the language of conservation science rather than in the language of Norse mythology, is structurally continuous with the Norse understanding of wolves and ravens as sacred presences whose relationship to the human world was mediated by forces that exceeded the purely practical and the purely material. The reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park in the United States in 1995, which has become one of the most studied and most celebrated examples of ecological restoration in the history of conservation biology, provides a compelling modern illustration of the kind of transformative ecological impact that the Norse attributed to the wolf's sacred power. The reintroduction of a small number of wolves to Yellowstone, where they had been absent for 70 years, triggered a cascade of ecological changes that transformed the park's landscape in ways that no one had fully anticipated, changes that biologists have described using the concept of a trophic cascade, a chain of effects that rippled through the entire ecosystem as the presence of wolves changed the behavior of elk, which changed the patterns of vegetation, which changed the course of rivers, which changed the structure of the landscape itself. This extraordinary demonstration of the wolf's power to reshape the physical world through the exercise of its predatory nature is, from a Norse perspective, entirely comprehensible within the framework of the wolf's sacred role as a creature whose hunger and whose power were fundamental to the maintenance of the natural order, whose removal from the landscape created an imbalance that could only be corrected by the wolf's return. The Norse, who understood Fenrir as the cosmic wolf whose binding caused distortions in the natural order and whose eventual release would inaugurate the transformation of the world, were expressing, in mythological language, an ecological intuition about the consequences of removing the wolf from its proper place in the web of life that modern conservation biology has now confirmed with extraordinary precision and detail. The raven's ecological role as a keystone, scavenger, and seed disperser has received less popular attention than the wolf's role as a keystone predator, but it is equally significant and equally consistent with the Norse understanding of the raven as a creature whose activities were fundamental to the maintenance of the cosmic order. Ravens are among the most important scavengers in the boreal and Arctic ecosystems of the northern world, consuming the remains of animals killed by wolves and other predators, and thereby accelerating the decomposition and nutrient cycling processes that maintain the fertility of northern soils. They are also important seed dispersers, consuming berries and other fruits, and depositing the seeds in their droppings across wide areas of the landscape, contributing to the regeneration and the diversity of plant communities. And they are, as we have already noted, important partners of wolves in the hunting process, providing aerial reconnaissance that enhances the wolves' hunting success, and thereby contributing indirectly to the predator-prey dynamics that maintain the health of the ecosystem as a whole. The raven's role in the ecosystem is, in other words, precisely analogous to its role in the Norse mythological framework, a creature that moves between different levels of the system, that transfers information and energy across the boundaries that separate different domains of the living world, and whose activities contribute to the maintenance of a dynamic balance that would be disrupted by its absence. The convergence between the Norse mythological understanding of wolves and ravens as sacred maintainers of the cosmic order and the modern ecological understanding of these animals as keystone species whose activities are fundamental to the health and the stability of northern ecosystems is one of the most remarkable and most thought-provoking aspects of the Norse sacred animal tradition's continued relevance in the modern world. It suggests that the Norse, through their centuries of intimate observation of wolves and ravens in the northern landscape, and through the sophisticated mythological framework they developed to make sense of what they observed, had arrived at an understanding of the ecological significance of these animals that was, in its essential structure, if not in its specific content, genuinely accurate, and understanding that expressed in spiritual and mythological terms the same fundamental truths about the role of predators and scavengers in maintaining the health of ecosystems that modern ecology has now documented through systematic, empirical research. This convergence does not, of course, make the Norse mythological framework scientifically valid, and it would be a mistake to conflate the mythological understanding of sacred animals with the scientific understanding of keystone species, because these are fundamentally different kinds of knowledge operating within fundamentally different frameworks of inquiry and validation. But it does suggest that the Norse practice of attending carefully and respectfully to the behavior and the significance of wolves and ravens, of taking these animals seriously as beings whose activities had consequences that extended far beyond the immediately observable, was not merely a cultural or spiritual practice, but was also, in its own way, a form of ecological knowledge, a form of understanding the natural world that, while expressed in a different language than the one we use today, was pointing toward some of the same truths about the structure and the dynamics of the living world. As we move toward the final pages of this long exploration of the Viking relationship with wolves and ravens, it is worth pausing to consider what it means, in the most personal and the most immediate sense, to engage with this tradition in the modern world, what it might actually look and feel like to recover something of the Norse quality of attention toward these animals, to begin to see the wolf and the raven not merely as interesting biological organisms or evocative cultural symbols, but as sacred presences that have something genuine and important to teach us about the nature of the world and our place within it. This is not a question that can be answered in abstract or theoretical terms alone, because the Norse relationship with wolves and ravens was not primarily an abstract or theoretical relationship, but was lived, embodied, experiential, rooted in the direct encounter with real animals, in real landscapes, and in the practices and the stories and the rituals through which the significance of those encounters was amplified and made available to the entire community. To recover something of this relationship in the modern world requires not just intellectual engagement with the Norse tradition, but a willingness to go beyond the intellectual and to cultivate the kind of direct, attentive, respectful engagement with the non-human world that the Norse maintained as a matter of spiritual discipline and cultural practice. This cultivation might begin with something as simple as paying attention, the kind of deep, patient, genuinely curious attention that the Norse brought to their observation of wolf and raven behavior in the northern landscape, an attention that is not merely the casual noticing of a creature's presence, but a sustained, deliberate engagement with the full complexity of the animal's life and behavior, an engagement that is willing to be surprised, willing to be challenged, willing to discover in the animal something that exceeds one's prior expectations and that complicates one's existing understanding of what the animal is and what it represents. Modern science has provided us with extraordinary tools for this kind of attention, from the radio tracking and GPS monitoring technologies that allow researchers to follow individual wolves through vast territories over months and years, to the behavioral experiments that reveal the remarkable cognitive abilities of ravens, to the genetic analyses that illuminate the evolutionary history of the human-wolf relationship and the ways in which our two species have been shaping each other's evolutionary trajectories for tens of thousands of years. These scientific tools are not obstacles to the kind of sacred attention that the Norse brought to wolves and ravens, but are, in their own way, expressions of it, extensions of the human capacity for paying attention to the non-human world that are continuous with, rather than opposed to, the observational traditions that gave rise to the Norse sacred animal relationships in the first place. But scientific attention alone is not sufficient to recover the full depth of the relationship that the Norse maintained with wolves and ravens, because the Norse relationship was not merely observational, but was also imaginative and emotional and spiritual, encompassing not just the careful observation of animal behavior, but the willingness to be moved by it, to be changed by it, to allow the encounter with the wolf and the raven, to challenge and to expand one's understanding of what consciousness is and what the world is and what it means to be alive in it. This dimension of the relationship requires not just the tools of science, but the tools of art and storytelling and ritual, and what we might call, for lack of a better term, spiritual practice. The practices of attention and contemplation and engagement that allow the significance of our encounters with the non-human world to sink into us more deeply than ordinary observation permits, to become not merely data points in our understanding of the world, but genuine transformative experiences that change the way we see and feel and think about the relationship between the human and the non-human, between the civilized and the wild, between the mortal and the sacred. The Norse sacred animal tradition offers us, across the centuries, both a model and an inspiration for this kind of deep, transformative engagement with the non-human world, a model that is richer and more philosophically sophisticated than almost anything that the modern world has produced in its place, and an inspiration that speaks to the deepest levels of the human need for a living relationship with the powers and the presences that exceed the purely human and that give human life its context and its meaning. The wolves and the ravens are still out there, still offering to those who are willing to pay attention the same lessons about strength and wisdom and the sacred indifference of the natural world that they offered to the Vikings, who first learned to see them as manifestations of the Vikings, divine. The question that the Norse sacred animal tradition finally asks us, in its deepest and most honest voice, is not whether we believe in Odin or in the Norse cosmology or in any of the specific theological content that the old tradition expressed through its stories of wolves and ravens and gods and fate. The question it asks is simpler and more demanding than that. A question that goes to the heart of what it means to be a conscious creature in a world that is vastly larger and older and more complex than any human civilization, a world that produced us and that will outlast us, and that, in the yellow eyes of the wolf and the black eyes of the raven, is still watching us with the same quality of ancient, patient, unflinching attention that it has always brought to the brief and brilliant experiment of human consciousness. The question is whether we are paying attention in return, and whether, if we are, we have the courage to let what we see change us. There is a moment that many people who have spent significant time in the northern wilderness describe with a consistency that is itself suggestive of something deeper than mere coincidence, a moment in which the ordinary boundaries of self and world seem to thin, in which the distance between the human observer and the observed landscape dissolves briefly and unexpectedly, and in which the presence of the non-human world becomes not merely an object of aesthetic appreciation or scientific interest, but something more immediate and more personally significant, something that feels, however fleetingly, like a genuine encounter, rather than merely an observation. This moment is most commonly reported in the context of encounters with large, intelligent animals, with wolves glimpsed at the edge of a forest, with ravens circling overhead in patterns that seem, despite all rational objection, to carry intention and purpose. And it is a moment that the Norse, who were intimately familiar with the northern wilderness and its inhabitants, would have recognized immediately as an encounter with the sacred, as one of those boundary experiences in which the distinction between the human world and the divine world became briefly and terrifyingly permeable. The fact that this kind of experience is still available to modern people, in an era when the boundaries between the human and the non-human have been more thoroughly reinforced than at any previous point in history, suggests that whatever the Norse were responding to in their sacred encounters with wolves and ravens was not merely a cultural construction, but was rooted in something real, something that persists in the actual nature of these animals and in the actual structure of the human nervous system that encounters them, something that the Norse mythological framework was designed to articulate and to honor, but that exists independently of any particular cultural or theological interpretation. The neurological and psychological research on human responses to encounters with large predators and with intelligent animals more generally provides some interesting scientific context for understanding why the Norse might have experienced encounters with wolves and ravens as encounters with the sacred, why these particular animals were so consistently singled out across the entire range of Norse culture as deserving of a special quality of spiritual attention. Research on what psychologists call awe, the complex emotional state that involves a sense of vastness or power that exceeds ordinary human scale, and a corresponding need to revise one's mental frameworks to accommodate the new experience, has demonstrated that encounters with large, powerful animals are among the most reliable triggers of awe in human subjects, and that the experience of awe is associated with a distinctive set of cognitive and social effects that include increased feelings of connection to others, decreased preoccupation with the individual self, heightened attentiveness to the present moment, and a greater willingness to engage with questions of meaning and purpose that ordinary self-concerned consciousness tends to suppress. These are precisely the cognitive and emotional effects that spiritual experiences in various traditions are designed to produce, and the fact that encounters with wolves and ravens can produce them through purely natural means, without any religious framework or ritual preparation, suggests that the Norse recognition of these animals as sacred presences was at least partly a recognition of their capacity to trigger genuine spiritual experiences in the human beings who encountered them. The intelligence of ravens, in particular, seems to play a specific and important role in the kind of awe-inducing encounter that might underlie the Norse sacred raven tradition. Encounters with highly intelligent, non-human animals have a distinctive quality that encounters with less cognitively complex animals do not share, a quality that arises from the sense that one is being observed by a mind that is genuinely evaluating what it sees, making decisions based on that evaluation, and responding in ways that reflect a genuine understanding of the human being as an individual with specific characteristics and specific intentions, rather than as a generic member of a potentially threatening species. Anyone who has been closely observed by a raven, subjected to that extraordinary black-eyed scrutiny that seems to penetrate to depths that ordinary animal curiosity cannot reach, will understand the experiential basis for the Norse belief that in the raven's gaze one could sense something of the divine, something of the quality of a consciousness that was not merely different from the human, but was in some way larger than the human, capable of a perspective that exceeded the individual and that encompassed a wider range of reality than any single human mind could contain. This is not a mystical claim, but a psychological one, rooted in the genuine cognitive sophistication of the raven and in the human nervous system's capacity to recognize and to respond to signs of intelligence in other organisms, a capacity that is itself one of the most remarkable products of evolutionary history and one of the foundations of the human social intelligence that has enabled our species to build the complex civilizations that define our bola existence. The wolf's capacity to trigger awe and to induce the kind of boundary-dissolving experience that the Norse associated with the sacred operates through somewhat different mechanisms than the ravens, mechanisms that are more physical and more visceral, and that engage deeper and more ancient layers of the human nervous system. The howl of a wolf, which carries over enormous distances and which has a quality that seems to reach directly into something ancient and pre-rational in the human auditory system, is one of the most reliably awe-inducing sounds in the natural world, capable of producing in human listeners a complex mixture of fear and wonder and inexplicable longing that defies easy rational explanation. Research on human responses to wolf howling has confirmed that people across vastly different cultural backgrounds, including people who have no prior experience with wolves and no cultural tradition that assigns any particular significance to them, respond to the sound of wolf, howling with a consistent pattern of heightened attention, increased arousal, and what can only be described as a quality of emotional resonance that seems disproportionate to the simple biological reality of one animal making a territorial vocalization. This universal human response to wolf howling, which does not depend on any specific cultural programming, suggests that the Norse experience of wolves as sacred presences was at least partly rooted in genuine neurological and psychological phenomena that are part of the common human heritage rather than being purely cultural constructions. The encounter between the human nervous system and the wolf or the raven thus creates a genuine experiential foundation for the sacred animal traditions that the Norse elaborated with such extraordinary sophistication and depth, a foundation that is not merely cultural but is biological and psychological, rooted in the actual capabilities of these animals and in the actual structure of the human mind that encounters them. This does not mean that the specific content of the Norse sacred animal tradition, the stories of Huginn and Muninn and Geri and Freki and Fenrir, is literally true in any empirical sense, but it does mean that the Norse were not simply inventing their sacred animal relationships out of nothing, were not merely projecting arbitrary cultural meanings onto indifferent natural phenomena, but were developing a culturally specific framework for articulating and honoring genuine experiential realities, genuine qualities of the encounter between human consciousness and the intelligence and the power of wolves and ravens that are real features of those encounters regardless of the cultural framework through which they are interpreted. Understanding this experiential foundation for the Norse sacred animal tradition is important because it helps us to see why the tradition has proven so enduringly resonant across such diverse cultural contexts, why the wolves and ravens of Norse mythology continue to speak to modern people who have no ancestral connection to Scandinavian culture and no prior knowledge of the Eddic texts. The resonance is not merely aesthetic or intellectual, but is rooted in the same fundamental human capacities for awe and wonder, and the recognition of non-human intelligence that gave rise to the tradition in the first place, capacities that are part of the common human heritage and that are available to anyone who is willing to cultivate the quality of attention that allows them to be activated. The Norse tradition provides a particularly rich and sophisticated cultural framework for cultivating this quality of attention and for making sense of the experiences that result from it. But the experiences themselves are not the exclusive property of any cultural tradition and are available in principle to anyone who is willing to spend time in the presence of wolves and ravens with the kind of open, passion, genuinely curious attention that the Norse brought to their sacred animal relationships. The practical implications of this understanding for the way we relate to wolves and ravens in the modern world are significant and potentially transformative. If the Norse sacred animal tradition is understood not as a relic of a superseded religious framework, but as a sophisticated cultural elaboration of genuine human experiences of the non-human world, experiences that are still available to us and that still have the capacity to expand and to challenge our understanding of consciousness and reality and the place of the human in the larger web of life. Then the recovery of something like the Norse quality of attention toward wolves and ravens becomes not merely a matter of historical or aesthetic interest, but a genuine spiritual and ecological imperative, a necessary component of any adequate response to the crisis of disconnection from the natural world that characterizes modern civilization, and that underlies so many of the environmental and social pathologies of our time. To learn to see wolves and ravens as sacred presences again, to recover the willingness to attend to them with the depth and the seriousness that the Norse brought to their sacred animal relationships, is not to retreat into a pre-scientific worldview or to abandon the genuine achievements of modern knowledge, but is to supplement and to complete that knowledge with a dimension of engagement and relationship that it currently lacks, a dimension that the Norse tradition, with its extraordinary richness and its philosophical honesty, is uniquely qualified to illuminate. The path toward this recovery is not a path of simple imitation of the Norse tradition, of putting on wolfskins, or carving raven images, or chanting Eddic poetry, though none of these practices is without value if done with genuine understanding and genuine intention. The path is rather a path of genuine engagement with the living tradition, both in its textual and archaeological dimensions and in the direct, embodied, experiential dimension that the Norse understood as the foundation of all genuine spiritual knowledge, the dimension of actual encounter with the actual animals in the actual northern landscape that is still, despite all the changes of the past millennium, available to those who seek it. The wolf and the raven are still there, still running through the northern forests and still wheeling above the mountain ridges, still embodying in their actual biological and behavioral reality the qualities that the Norse recognized as sacred, the ferocity and the endurance of the wolf, and the intelligence and the perception of the raven, the social complexity and the predatory power of the wolf pack, and the extraordinary cognitive flexibility and the interspecies cooperation of the raven. To encounter these animals in the wild, to spend time in their presence with the quality of attention that allows their full reality to register, is to have access to the same experiential foundation that gave rise to the Norse sacred animal tradition, and to be invited across the millennia to continue the work of understanding and honoring the non-human world that the Norse began with such extraordinary depth and sophistication. The continuing existence of wolves and ravens in the world is therefore not merely an ecological fact, but a spiritual opportunity, an invitation extended by the living natural world to those who are willing to accept it, an invitation to recover the quality of relationship with the non-human that the Norse maintained as a matter of cultural and spiritual survival, and that modern civilization has largely abandoned to its very great cost. The Norse understood in the deepest possible way that human beings needed the wolf and the raven, not merely as resources or as symbols, but as genuine presences in the world, whose existence and whose qualities enriched and challenged and deepened the human experience of being alive. And they built a spiritual tradition of extraordinary power and sophistication around this understanding. That tradition is still available to us, preserved in the Eddic texts and the saga literature and the archaeological record of the Viking Age, and it speaks to us across the centuries with a voice that is at once ancient and urgently contemporary, a voice that asks whether we are ready to learn again what the Norse knew, whether we are brave enough and honest enough and attentive enough to allow the wolf and the raven to teach us what they have always been willing to teach on the truth about the world and our place within it, and the terms on which a fully conscious and fully responsible human life must be lived. The story of why the Vikings kept wolves and ravens as sacred companions is, at its deepest level, a story about the human need for a relationship with the sacred that is rooted not in abstraction or in theological doctrine, but in the living, breathing, howling, calling reality of the non-human world. A world that is older and vaster and more complex than any human civilization, and that produced us, and that will outlast us, and that, in the yellow eyes of the wolf and the black eyes of the raven, continues to regard us with the same patient, penetrating, magnificent attention that it has always brought to the brief and brilliant experiment of our existence. The Norse honored this attention. They built their greatest mythology around it. They embedded it in their deepest poetry and their most sacred rituals and their most elaborately crafted objects. They gave it names and stories and a place at the very center of their understanding of the divine. And in doing so, they created something that has proven to be among the most enduring and the most significant contributions that any civilization has made to the ongoing human project of understanding what we are and what we owe to the world, that made us a contribution that is not diminished by the passage of time, but is, if anything, more urgently relevant now than it has ever been before, speaking to us across the silence of the centuries with the voice of the raven and the howl of the wolf, reminding us, as it has always reminded those who were willing to listen, that the world is sacred, that the animals are sacred, that the relationship between the human and the non-human is sacred, and that the loss of this recognition is not merely a cultural impoverishment, but a spiritual emergency that we ignore at our very great peril. In the end, the terrifying spiritual truth that the Viking relationship with wolves and ravens embodies is not a truth about gods or mythology or the specific content of the Norse theological imagination, but a truth about the nature of attention and the nature of relationship and the nature of the sacred itself, a truth that can be stated simply, but that requires a lifetime of practice to truly understand and truly live. The truth is this, that the world is full of presences that exceed the human, that these presences are not threats to be managed or resources to be exploited, but teachers and companions and mirrors whose company is essential to the full development of human consciousness and human wisdom, and that the willingness to attend to them with honesty and with respect and with the courage to be changed by what one encounters in their company is not merely a spiritual luxury, but is the foundation of any genuine understanding of what it means to be alive in this world at this time. The Norse knew this. The wolves and the ravens taught them. And across the 1,000 years and more that separate us from the world of the Vikings, the wolves are still running and the ravens are still flying, and the lesson is still available, still offered freely to anyone who is willing to go out into the northern morning and stand still and pay attention and allow the ancient, patient, magnificent, non-human world to do what it has always done for those who are willing to receive it, which is to expand the boundaries of the possible and to reveal in the space beyond those boundaries the sacred reality that has been there all along, waiting, as it has always been waiting, for the human eye and the human heart to open wide enough to finally, truly see it. The wolves run, the ravens fly, the world turns on its ancient axis, indifferent and beautiful and terrible and sacred, exactly as it has always been, exactly as the Norse understood it to be. And the question that the Viking relationship with these extraordinary animals finally leaves us with, the question that echoes across the centuries in the howl of the wolf and the call of the raven, is not a question about the past, but a question about the present and the future, a question about what kind of relationship we are willing to maintain with the living world that surrounds us and sustains us. And that is, in the most profound and the most literal sense, the only home we have ever had or ever will have. The Norse answered this question with wolves and ravens, with mythology and ritual and poetry and art, with the fierce, clear-eyed, courageous engagement with reality that is the deepest and the most enduring legacy of the Viking spirit. The answer that we give in our own time and in our own way to the same eternal question will determine not just the fate of wolves and ravens in the modern world, but the fate of the human capacity for wonder and for wisdom, and for the sacred relationship with the non-human. That is, as the Norse understood with such extraordinary clarity and depth, not a supplement to human life, but its very foundation, the ground from which all genuine understanding grows, and without which the human spirit, like the bound wolf straining against its silken chains, will strain forever against the limits of a world too small and too silent and too thoroughly human to sustain the full depth and the full breadth of what we are and what we might, if we are wise enough and brave enough to remember what the ravens and the wolves have always known, yet become